In this video, I want to pick up on the idea of disposable income and its two constituent components that we talked about in prior videos with relation to disposable income. And just as a refresher, you remember in the income approach to GDP calculation, we started out with GDP and we worked our way down to national income and then personal income, which was the income that is earned by households prior to taxes. And if we take personal taxes out, primarily income taxes, we get disposable income. And then the two constituent complementary components of this are consumption and savings. And so think about this: any household that earns an income after tax has only two options with what to do with that income: is spend it on consumption or to save it. And so we're going to talk about the dynamics of consumption and savings. By the way, even if someone were to give a charitable contribution, it would count primarily as consumption because it doesn't meet really the definition of savings, and that is this idea of deferred consumption being placed with primarily a financial intermediary. So what I've done here on this on the graphs is I've taken disposable income as the common variable on the horizontal axes, and I've got three variables, only two axes, and so I've got to basically use two graphs. So I'm keeping the disposable income variable on the horizontal, and I've got consumption and savings in the vertical. What I've done with both of these, since these first quadrant planes are 90-degree angles, if we were to bisect those with this imaginary line that we call the line of equality, we have a 45-degree line. And what that basically means is any value that lies on this imaginary dashed line is equivalent values to both axes. Okay, equivalent values. And we can do this because of the fact that all of these variables are expressed in dollars. Consumption is expressed in dollars. Disposable income and savings are all expressed in dollars. And so what I want to talk about is what is the relationship between disposable income, consumption, and savings. So if we were to start out and to try to graph what this will look like, we would start somewhere not at zero, but rather someplace right here with consumption. And this value, this distance between this point on the vertical axis and the origin, is what's known as autonomous consumption. And the reason that we call this autonomous is the idea that it doesn't bear any relationship necessarily at this point, that is, to disposable income. That even if one's income were zero, it doesn't mean one would stop consuming, and presumably that amount would be financed by borrowing or withdrawing savings from someplace else that's available. And so as a result of this, we have this kind of thing here. We have the consumption function looks something like that, and it's upward sloping, and I'll talk a bit more about the slope and what that means in relation to the consumption function. So here's what's going on. So we've got a consumption function, upward sloping, meaning that as income rises, consumption also rises. So as a result, we have this particular thing going on. So at this point here, this is an interesting fact right there. What's happening is we said that any value that lies on this dashed line represents equivalent values on either axis, and that is in fact the case. And so at this point right here, what can we say about this particular point here? If consumption equals disposable income, then what does that mean? The only way that consumption can equal disposable income is if there is zero savings. There's zero savings. And so what is everything then to the left of this, where consumption is greater than disposable income, at every point up to the left of this entire shaded region then is an area that we would refer to as dissavings. Dissavings. And dissavings sounds like, sort of a made-up word. It maybe even sounds like it's problematic, and it's really not, because I think a lot of households find themselves in dissavings conditions a lot of the time. And how is dissavings financed? Usually through borrowing. That is, how can anybody finance consumption that exceeds disposable income? Through borrowing or liquidation of some asset somewhere. And so for this region here, we call it dissavings. Where consumption equals disposable income, then there is zero savings. And if we were to bring this down then on the savings function there, we'd plot this point as well, where there's also zero savings. Okay? And then anything to the right of this then, we have disposable income being greater than consumption. Disposable income greater than consumption. So for this shaded region here, we say this is the region of savings. And so this becomes a positive value from that point to the right. All right, so we've got the consumption function plotted. What about the slope of the consumption function that we should talk about? Well, if we think about what a slope is, it's the rise over run that we've studied for quite some time now. The rise over the run, in other words, the change in the vertical over the change in the horizontal, In this case, it's the change in consumption over the change in disposable income. And we have a definite relationship for that we simply refer to as the marginal propensity to consume. What does that mean, marginal propensity? If you look at the readings, it'll talk about the fact that for the next dollar of income received, how much of it will get channeled to savings. Now, we're interested in the big picture macro view. It's not necessarily what any single household would do, but what will the entirety of households do if there's a change in disposable income, made possible maybe through some policy change like a tax cut or an increase in government spending. Anything that would change the disposable income of households would result in some change to consumption, and that change is the rise over the run, the marginal propensity to consume. And so we'll come back to this in a second once we talk more about the savings function, okay? So at this point here, back to the point which consumption crosses the line of equality, we have a point of zero savings, positive savings to the right, dis-savings to the left, or negative savings. Well, if this is negative savings, then we must have a value here on the savings function that must correspond to the dis-savings. And if we were to plot the area, or measure the area here of what looks like an isosceles triangle, it would be equivalent to this area down here of negative savings, below the 0 point on the vertical axis. And then to the right of this point is positive savings. And so as a result, we now have a savings function. And I guess I could make that look a little more linear. We have a savings function that looks something like that. And this region here then, that is savings up above, the difference between consumption and disposable income is now savings, and so we have savings represented there as well. And what about the savings function should we know? Well, it's got a slope as well. It's a positively sloped function, and as a result of this, we have the change in savings divided by the change in disposable income has its own slope that we refer to as the marginal propensity to save. And we say that both of these functions are complementary, one to the other, and the relationship here in terms of this complementary nature is the idea that together these equal 100%. That is, the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save equals 1 or 100%. And that's an important relationship for us to know because, let's say, if we know the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, then we must know the marginal propensity to save is 0.2. And it's a very important relationship for us to be aware of because if there are changes in these marginal propensities, it's going to change our understanding of the way households behave with regard to some change in income. And so together these relationships are complementary, and I say they're complementary because they fold together. There's no way that these can equal anything but 100% because there's only two ways to channel disposable income, consumption and savings. And then one final point in this video that I should talk about, which your book gets into in much more detail, is that of the multiplier. Why are we even studying this in the first place? It's to know what might happen with a policy change in terms of what households would do, and that is the idea of the consumption multiplier. And the consumption multiplier is basically this. It's equal to the reciprocal of the marginal propensity to save. So the lower the marginal propensity to save, the higher the multiplier, because it's in the denominator. And the higher the marginal propensity to save, the lower the multiplier. And what the multiplier basically means is this. Any change that's made to disposable income gets magnified from household to household with additional rounds of spending, and the higher that multiplier, the bigger that impact is as it ripples through the macroeconomy. So a very high multiplier, which implies a very low savings rate, means there's going to be a big bang for the buck if there's a change to disposable income. So something like a 0.9 MPC, which means a 0.1 MPS, will give a multiplier of 10, meaning if there's a change in consumption of $100, it translates actually to $1,000 of new income generated throughout the economy, remembering the idea that my spending is your income is my spending, so there's that sort of collective relationship. And obviously the $100 and the $1,000, those are small ball numbers, but if we magnify those and put 9 zeros on them, for instance, then it might make them, or 12 zeros, it might make a very meaningful impact as to what is being expressed here. So the multiplier is simply the reciprocal of this savings, what we call leakage, and that is the idea that savings doesn't get channeled back into this new spending, so the higher the amount of marginal propensity to consume, the bigger the multiplier, and that's the relationship that we want to focus on here. And I'd be more than glad to talk with anybody who has questions about this in some greater detail.